"You're too fat and lazy to ever amount to anything in my kitchen." Those words cut through Maya Rodriguez like a serrated knife through delicate pastry. She stood there, flour dusting her chef's whites, her hands trembling as her boss Thomas Brennan sneered at her across the pristine stainless steel counter. This was the same man who'd been selling her creations for triple the price, taking credit for her genius while she worked 70-hour weeks in his shadow. Maya was 25 years old, a culinary school graduate with more talent in her fingertips than most pastry chefs develop in a lifetime. She'd poured everything into this job at Portland's most prestigious bakery, believing hard work would earn respect. Instead, she got daily humiliation. But what Thomas Brennan didn't know was that his cruelty was about to cost him everything. If you believe in second chances and powerful comebacks, hit that like button and follow this channel. Because what you're about to hear is how one woman turned workplace abuse into a confectionery empire, proving that talent, determination, and sweetness can be the ultimate revenge. Now, let me tell you how it all began. Maya had always found her sanctuary in sugar and butter. At 25, she'd spent every penny of her savings on culinary school, specifically the advanced pastry program at the California Confectionery Institute in San Francisco. While other students complained about the early mornings and the demanding French instructors, Maya thrived. Her hands understood dough like some people understood music. She could feel when the meringue reached stiff peaks without even looking. Her creations weren't just desserts, they were edible poetry. The curves of her body matched the curves of her decorated cakes, both generous, both unapologetically present, both worthy of celebration. Her instructors had praised her innovation, her flavor combinations that shouldn't work, but somehow sang on the palate. Lavender and lemon, cardamom and chocolate, rose and pistachio. She'd graduated top of her class, and her final project, a 7-tier wedding cake with hand-painted edible flowers, had made her instructor cry with its beauty. Landing the job at Brennan's bakery had felt like destiny knocking on her door. It was the most prestigious pastry shop in Portland, Oregon, the kind of place food critics wrote glowing reviews about, where wedding cakes started at $5,000 and celebrities ordered birthday confections. Thomas Brennan himself had interviewed her in his gleaming office above the bakery, his eyes scanning her portfolio with what she'd mistaken for approval. She remembered how his gaze had traveled slowly up and down her body, lingering on her full hips and soft arms, his lip curling slightly in barely concealed disgust. "You certainly look like you enjoy your own baking," he'd said, the words dripping with disdain masked as humor. Maya had felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she'd forced a bright smile, desperate for the opportunity. She needed this job. The student loans were crushing her, $60,000 hanging over her head like a storm cloud. Her tiny studio apartment barely had room for a proper oven. This job was her ticket to everything she'd dreamed about since she was a little girl, watching her grandmother make tres leches cake. The daily reality at Brennan's slowly revealed the true nature of her new boss and the prison she'd walked into with such hope. Thomas Brennan was a 48-year-old man who'd inherited his father's business and believed his last name alone made him a culinary genius. Every morning, Maya arrived at 4 a.m. to start the croissant dough, her alarm clock dragging her from dreams of her own bakery where she'd be appreciated. She'd pull her thick, dark hair into a tight bun, slip on her chef's whites that she'd bought 2 sizes larger to avoid them clinging to her curves, and step into the industrial kitchen that smelled of yeast and possibility. The other employees, mostly front-of-house staff, would arrive hours later. For those precious early morning hours, it was just Maya and the dough, her hands working the butter into thin, flaky layers, her mind at peace. She'd hum old songs her grandmother taught her, Mexican lullabies that made the bread rise with love. But that peace would shatter the moment Thomas Brennan walked through the door. The first microaggression came disguised as concern, the way poison sometimes comes wrapped in pretty paper. 2 weeks into the job, Thomas had walked past her workstation where she was piping delicate rosettes onto a wedding cake. "Maya, sweetheart, maybe you should let me handle the high-profile orders," he'd said, his voice syrupy with false kindness. "We can't have our clients worried about presentation." His eyes had flicked to her body, the meaning crystal clear. She wasn't the image he wanted representing his bakery. Never mind that her technique was flawless, that her sugar flowers looked more real than actual flowers, that her flavor profiles were innovative and complex. In Thomas Brennan's eyes, her body disqualified her from excellence. Maya had nodded silently, swallowing the hurt, telling herself it would get better. She'd prove herself through her work. Talent would speak louder than his prejudice. She'd been so naive, so hopeful, so willing to believe in meritocracy in a world that judged her by her dress size before it ever tasted her creations. The disrespect escalated like a slow-building storm, each incident worse than the last, until Maya could barely breathe under the weight of it. Thomas began calling her into his office to critique her work, always finding something wrong no matter how perfect her execution. "These macarons are acceptable, but you really should work on your precision," he'd say, even though her macarons had perfectly smooth tops and delicate feet, textbook examples of the notoriously difficult French cookie. He'd sample her creations in front of her, his face contorting as if tasting something mediocre. Then he'd smile coldly and say, "I suppose it'll do for the regular customers." But Maya noticed something that made her blood boil. The pastries he criticized to her face were the same ones he'd present to important clients as his own masterpieces. She'd overhear him through the office door, describing his innovative flavor combinations, his delicate technique, his artistic vision. Her work, her soul poured into sugar and flour, stolen and rebranded as the genius of Thomas Brennan. And when she tried to speak up, to gently remind him that she'd created that particular recipe, he'd silence her with a look that could curdle cream. The breaking point came on a sweltering August afternoon when the bakery was packed with customers and the AC had broken down. Maya had been working for 12 hours straight, filling a massive order for a corporate event, 200 individual desserts that needed to be perfect. Her chef's whites were soaked with sweat, her feet ached in her non-slip shoes, and her lower back screamed from hours of standing. She'd just finished the last tray of chocolate eclairs, each one filled with vanilla bean pastry cream and topped with glossy dark chocolate ganache, when Thomas burst into the kitchen with a client. The woman was elegant, dripping with diamonds, clearly wealthy and important. Thomas was in full showman mode, gesturing grandly as he described his process and his inspiration. Then his eyes landed on Maya, and something vicious flickered across his face. "This is our kitchen assistant," he said dismissively, as if Maya were nothing more than someone who washed dishes. "She helps with the basic prep work." The client smiled politely at Maya, who stood there covered in chocolate, her life's work reduced to basic prep work by a man who couldn't make a proper Genoese sponge if his life depended on it. Maya's hands shook as she removed her apron, chocolate fingerprints staining the white fabric like evidence of her labor. She wanted to scream, to throw one of those perfect eclairs in Thomas Brennan's smug face, to tell that client exactly who had created every single pastry in the display case that bore his name. But she didn't. She couldn't. The fear was too great, the voice in her head too loud. The one that had been planted there by years of being told that girls who looked like her should be grateful for any opportunity. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Mija, sometimes we have to swallow our pride to survive." So Maya swallowed. She swallowed the rage, the hurt, the profound injustice of being erased. She walked to the small bathroom, locked herself in, and let the tears come silently, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. In the mirror, she saw a woman she barely recognized, someone who'd let herself become invisible, someone who'd traded her dignity for a paycheck. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead like a dying insect, and Maya made a decision, not today, but soon. Soon, she would stop swallowing. Soon, she would speak. That night, Maya couldn't sleep despite her exhaustion, her mind replaying the day's humiliation on an endless loop. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling of her cramped studio apartment, listening to the sounds of Portland nightlife filtering through her window. Her body ached, but her soul ached worse. She thought about culinary school, how alive she'd felt creating in those kitchens, how her instructors had celebrated her innovations. She thought about her grandmother, who died 2 years ago, who taught her that food was love made visible, that feeding people was sacred work. What would Abuela think if she could see Maya now, hiding in the back of someone else's kitchen, letting a mediocre man take credit for her gifts? The shame was suffocating. But beneath the shame, something else stirred, something that felt like embers beginning to glow. A tiny voice whispered, "You don't have to accept this. You're not powerless. Your talent belongs to you, not to him." Maya turned onto her side, pulled her grandmother's recipe book from her nightstand, and held it against her chest like a talisman. Maybe there was another way. The memory came to her unbidden as she finally drifted towards sleep, a moment from childhood she hadn't thought about in years. She was 8 years old, sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table in their small house in San Diego, watching Abuela's weathered hands work masa into perfect tortillas. A neighbor woman had come by, Mrs. Patterson from next door, complaining that the Mexican cooking smells were too strong and asking if they could tone it down. Maya had watched her grandmother's face, expecting anger or hurt. Instead, Abuela had smiled, wrapped up a dozen fresh tortillas with homemade salsa, and handed them to Mrs. Patterson. "Here," she'd said in her accented English, "try them first, then tell me if you want me to stop." Mrs. Patterson had returned an hour later, sheepish and apologetic, asking for the recipe. Abuela had laughed, that deep, joyful laugh that made her whole body shake. "Mija," she told young Maya, "never let small people make you feel small. The best revenge is to be so good they can't ignore you." Maya's eyes opened in the darkness. Her grandmother had been right. The answer wasn't to shrink, to hide, to accept Thomas Brennan's cruelty. The answer was to be undeniably, spectacularly, impossibly excellent. The next morning arrived with the piercing sound of her alarm clock, and Maya dragged herself back to Brennan's bakery with new determination burning quietly in her chest. She wouldn't quit today. She needed this job still, needed the money, needed to learn everything she could before she made her move. So she'd bide her time, she'd watch, she'd absorb every aspect of running a successful bakery, even from a tyrant like Thomas. She'd smile through the insults, document her creations, save her money and plan. The kitchen was her domain in those early morning hours, and she used that time to experiment, to push her skills even further. She created a new croissant, one flavored with brown butter and sea salt, that made the early arriving delivery driver actually moan with pleasure. She perfected a chocolate tart so rich and complex it could make angels weep. Every creation was better than the last, and she photographed each one secretly on her phone before Thomas could claim them as his own. Evidence, proof, her portfolio growing day by day. Soon, she promised herself, soon she'd be ready to step into her own light. Weeks turned into months, and the bakery's reputation grew exponentially. Lines forming outside before opening, food bloggers posting rave reviews, wedding bookings extending 2 years out. Thomas Brennan preened like a peacock, giving interviews to local magazines, appearing on morning cooking shows, always taking full credit for the renaissance of Brennan's bakery. But Maya knew the truth. Every single item that had made the bakery famous had come from her hands, her heart, her midnight experiments, and grandmother's wisdom. The lavender honey cake that the Portland Tribune called transcendent, hers. The pistachio cream puffs that had gone viral on Instagram, hers. The chocolate raspberry torte that a food critic claimed was the best dessert in the Pacific Northwest, all hers. And as she watched Thomas accept praise for work he hadn't done, something hardened inside her. The embers were becoming a flame. The question wasn't if she'd leave anymore. The question was when and how spectacular her departure would be. Then everything changed the day Thomas hired Jake Mitchell, and Maya's carefully controlled world shifted on its axis in ways she never expected. She was elbow-deep in brioche dough when Thomas walked into the kitchen with a lanky young man who looked barely 22, all nervous energy and eager smiles. "Maya, this is Jake, your new assistant," Thomas announced, as if Maya had any say in the matter, as if her kitchen wasn't about to be invaded. "Show him the basics. The orders have increased, and I suppose even you can't handle everything alone, despite all that time you spend eating in here." The casual cruelty landed like it always did, a small knife between the ribs, made worse by being delivered in front of a stranger. Maya felt her face burn with humiliation, but she forced herself to look at Jake to assess this new complication. What she saw surprised her. Jake's eyes had narrowed at Thomas's comment, his jaw tightening, a flash of anger crossing his boyish face before he carefully smoothed it away. He met Maya's gaze directly. No pity, no judgment, just a clear acknowledgement that he'd witnessed something wrong. The anger that had been simmering inside Maya for months finally found its voice, though she kept it locked behind her teeth for now, letting it fuel her hands instead of her mouth. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, arriving even earlier, staying even later, creating pastries that were almost aggressive in their perfection. Each piped rosette was a silent scream. Each perfectly glazed tart was a middle finger to Thomas Brennan's casual cruelty. Jake watched her work with wide eyes during those first weeks, barely speaking, just observing the way her hands moved with absolute confidence, the way she could tell the temperature of chocolate just by how it fell from her spatula, the way she assembled complex desserts without ever consulting a recipe. On his third day, he'd whispered, "You're incredible," like actually incredible. "I went to culinary school for 2 years, and I've never seen anyone work like you." Maya had simply nodded, not trusting herself to respond, afraid that kindness might crack the armor she'd built. But something in her chest had loosened just slightly. Someone saw her, really saw her. Jake became her shadow in the kitchen, eager to learn but also protective in ways that surprised Maya and clearly irritated Thomas. When Thomas would bark criticism at Maya's work, Jake would quietly point out the technical perfection of what she'd created, his voice steady and factual. "Actually, Mr. Brennan, Maya's sugar work on those cake toppers is textbook perfect. The temperature control required for that is really advanced." Thomas would glare at him, but Jake never backed down, never apologized for defending her. During their lunch breaks, stolen moments sitting on the back steps of the bakery, Jake told Maya about his own journey into baking, how he'd grown up in a small town in Washington state, how his football coach father had been disgusted when Jake chose culinary school over college sports. "He told me baking was for women and, well, he used some slurs I won't repeat," Jake said quietly, his sandwich untouched in his hands. "But I didn't care. Creating something beautiful and delicious, feeding people, making them happy, that's not weak, that's powerful." Maya felt tears prick her eyes. This kid understood. He got it in a way she hadn't expected. The research began innocuously enough, late nights in Maya's apartment after exhausting days at the bakery, her laptop glowing in the darkness as she fell down rabbit holes of information. She started by looking up employment law, reading about hostile work environments, documentation of abuse, wrongful termination protections. She discovered that she had rights, that what Thomas was doing could be considered harassment, that his theft of her creative work might actually be actionable, but the legal route felt like quicksand, expensive and slow, and likely to end with her blacklisted in Portland's tight-knit culinary community. So she pivoted her research. She studied business licenses, commercial kitchen requirements, health department regulations, small business loans for women and minorities. She read success stories of pastry chefs who'd gone independent, who'd started with farmers' market tables and grown into brick-and-mortar shops. She analyzed their Instagram strategies, their pricing models, their branding. Knowledge became her weapon, information her armor. Every night, she stayed up until 2 a.m., reading until her eyes burned, planning her escape like a general preparing for war. Her first small act of defiance came on a Tuesday morning when a regular customer, Mrs. Chen, asked specifically about the baker who made her daughter's birthday cake. Maya was restocking the display case when she heard Mrs. Chen say to Thomas, "I've never tasted anything so perfect. The person who made that is a true artist. I'd love to commission them for my anniversary." Maya watched through the kitchen door as Thomas puffed up with false modesty. "Well, I'm certainly proud of my work. I've been perfecting my craft for decades." Before she could stop herself, before fear could silence her, Maya pushed through the door and said clearly, "I made your daughter's cake, Mrs. Chen. I'm so glad she enjoyed it." The silence that followed felt like the air before lightning strikes. Thomas's face went purple with rage, but he couldn't contradict her in front of a valued customer. Mrs. Chen's eyes went wide, looking between Maya and Thomas, understanding dawning on her face. "Oh," she said slowly, "I see. Well, Maya, I'd like to order my anniversary cake from you specifically. Can we arrange that?" The aftermath of that moment was volcanic, and Maya braced herself for the eruption she knew was coming. The second Mrs. Chen left the bakery, Thomas grabbed Maya's arm and dragged her into his office, his fingers digging into her soft flesh, hard enough to leave bruises. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snarled, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. "You work for me. Everything you make in my kitchen is mine. You're nothing but a fat girl who got lucky I gave you a chance. You really think you could survive out there on your own? You're delusional." Maya wrenched her arm free, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. For the first time, she didn't look down. She met his eyes directly. "I know exactly what I make in your kitchen, Thomas, and I know you've been taking credit for all of it. Every award, every review, every customer who comes back, that's my work, not yours." His hand raised, and for a terrifying moment Maya thought he might actually hit her. But Jake's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Brennan, the delivery truck is here. They need you to sign for the chocolate shipment." Jake stood in the doorway, his phone conspicuously pointed at them, clearly recording. Thomas lowered his hand, straightened his shirt, and stalked out, leaving Maya shaking. The flashback hit Maya that night with the force of a physical blow, memory rising up from the depths where she'd buried it for 15 years. She was 10 years old, standing in the cafeteria of her elementary school in San Diego, holding her lunch tray with her grandmother's homemade tamales wrapped in foil. The popular girls, led by a blonde named Ashley, had pointed at her and laughed. "Look how fat Maya is," Ashley had announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I bet she eats like 10 lunches, that's so gross." The other kids had laughed, and Maya had stood there frozen, her face burning, tears streaming down her cheeks. She'd thrown her lunch in the trash and hidden in the bathroom until lunch period ended. She'd started skipping meals after that, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. It had taken her grandmother months to figure out why Maya was always tired, why her grades were dropping, why she'd stopped baking with Abuela on weekends. When the truth came out, her grandmother had held her and cried, "Mija, there is nothing wrong with your body. Nothing. Those girls are empty inside, so they try to empty you too. Don't let them, don't ever let them." But Maya had let them. She'd let Ashley's cruelty shape her for years, and now she was letting Thomas Brennan do the same thing. No more. Jake found Maya crying in the walk-in freezer the next morning, her breath making clouds in the frigid air, her body shaking from cold and emotion. He didn't say anything at first, just grabbed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, then sat down beside her on a milk crate. Finally, he spoke. "My little sister is big, like you, and she's the most amazing person I know, smart and funny and kind, but the world treats her like garbage. She tried to kill herself last year. She was 16. His voice cracked, and Maya turned to look at him, seeing tears on his face. "I found her in time. She's okay now. But I swore that day that I'd never let anyone abuse someone because of their body and stay silent. That's why I speak up when Thomas goes after you. That's why I'm recording everything. Because nobody should be treated like you're being treated. Nobody. Maya reached out and squeezed his hand, this young man who'd become her unexpected ally, her witness, her proof that she wasn't crazy, that the abuse was real. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." Maya began practicing her voice in small ways, testing her courage like someone learning to walk after an injury. When Thomas criticized her lemon tarts in front of Jake, she calmly explained the technique she'd used and why it was correct. When he tried to take a phone call in the middle of her explaining a complex order, she kept talking until he had to acknowledge her. When he made another comment about her body, she looked him in the eye and said, "My body has nothing to do with my skill. Please focus on the work." Each small rebellion was terrifying, her heart racing, her hands shaking, but she did it anyway. Jake had her back, always there with a supportive comment or a distraction when Thomas looked ready to explode. The other employees began to notice the shift too. Sarah, the front counter manager, started asking Maya directly about special orders instead of going through Thomas. The delivery drivers complimented her creations. Slowly, painfully, Maya was reclaiming her voice, and the more she used it, the stronger it became. She was waking up, and there would be no going back to sleep. The community awareness began organically, spreading like yeast through warm dough, impossible to contain once it started. Food bloggers who'd been praising Brennan's bakery started noticing discrepancies. When Thomas appeared on a morning show demonstrating his signature lavender cake, a blogger named Jessica, who'd taken one of Maya's weekend workshops months earlier, recognized the technique. "Wait," Jessica tweeted, "that's exactly how Maya Rodriguez taught us to fold in the lavender. Interesting." The tweet got shared, and questions began circulating. Why had Brennan's pastries gotten exponentially better exactly when Maya was hired? Why did Thomas always make excuses when people asked to watch him work? Why did his demonstrations on TV always involve pre-made components? A local food journalist named Marcus started digging, interviewing former Brennan's employees, piecing together a pattern. He reached out to Maya for comment, but she declined, not ready yet, too afraid. But the seed was planted. People were noticing, people were questioning. The narrative Thomas had controlled for so long was starting to crack. The weakness in Thomas Brennan's armor revealed itself in the most unexpected way, through his own arrogance and sloppiness. Jake had been documenting everything, his phone constantly recording audio during their shifts, building a file of evidence. One afternoon, Jake was reviewing footage when he caught something that made him call Maya immediately. "You need to see this," he said urgently. Maya went to his apartment that evening, and Jake showed her the video. It was Thomas on the phone in his office, door slightly ajar, Jake's phone recording from the hallway. Thomas was talking to a supplier, ordering pre-made pastry components, frozen croissant dough, artificial flavoring extracts, the kind of shortcuts no serious pastry chef would use. "Yeah, I just need it to look good," Thomas was saying. "Nobody can tell the difference anyway. I'll just put it in my boxes and charge premium prices." But the real bombshell was what he said next. "My father built this business on quality, but quality doesn't scale. My decorator makes the fancy stuff for display, keeps the food bloggers happy, but I'm not wasting high-end ingredients on regular customers." Maya felt sick. Not only was he stealing credit for her work, he was adulterating the business, cutting corners, betraying customers who trusted the Brennan name. Maya's bold plan crystallized in her mind over the next few weeks, each piece falling into place like a perfectly constructed layer cake. She would leave Brennan's, but not in defeat, not slinking away in shame. She would leave spectacularly, publicly, and she would take her reputation with her. She started making copies of everything, her recipe notebooks, her design portfolios, the photographs of her creations. She consulted with a lawyer using her carefully saved money, establishing that her recipes were her intellectual property, that Thomas had no legal right to them. She applied for a business license. She reached out to Mrs. Chen and a handful of other customers who'd specifically requested her work. quietly asking if they'd be interested in ordering from her directly. Every single one said yes. She created an Instagram account under her full name, Maya Rodriguez Pastry Artist, and started posting photos of her creations with detailed descriptions of her techniques and inspiration. The account grew quickly, food lovers responding to her authenticity and obvious skill. She was building her platform, her proof, her foundation. The final preparation stage felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Maya gave her 2 weeks' notice on a Monday morning, walking into Thomas's office with her resignation letter and her head held high. His reaction was predictable, rage and dismissiveness mixed together. "You'll never make it," he spat. "You need me. You're nothing without this bakery." Maya smiled, and it was genuine. "I guess we'll see." And for those final 2 weeks, she worked harder than ever, creating a portfolio of her absolute best work. Photographing everything, building her collection of proof. Jake worked beside her, equally determined, having given his own notice the same day. "Where you go, I go," he'd said simply. "I'm not staying here without you, and besides, I believe in you." And on her last day, Maya arrived at 4 a.m. as always, but this time she baked something special, a towering croquembouche filled with her signature vanilla bean cream, decorated with spun sugar that caught the light like gold. She photographed it, posted it to her rapidly growing Instagram with the caption, "My final creation at Brennan's Bakery. Tomorrow, I begin creating under my own name. Maya Rodriguez, Pastry Artist, custom orders now open. Atel." The confrontation began the moment Maya posted that Instagram photo, the digital equivalent of throwing down a gauntlet in the town square. Within an hour, the post had hundreds of likes and dozens of comments from food bloggers, former customers, and industry professionals. "Wait, you're the one who's been making all those incredible pastries," one comment read. "I knew it couldn't have been Brennan. He's never been that innovative," read another. Maya watched the numbers climb on her phone, her heart pounding, knowing Thomas would see it soon. She didn't have to wait long. He stormed into the kitchen at 7 a.m., his face purple with rage, his phone clutched in his shaking hand. "What the hell is this?" he screamed, shoving the phone in her face. "You can't do this. You signed a non-compete. I'll sue you into oblivion. I'll make sure you never work in this city again." Maya carefully set down the piping bag she'd been holding, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to face him fully. Her voice when she spoke was calm and clear, echoing in the industrial kitchen. "I didn't sign a non-compete, Thomas. You never gave me one. I checked with a lawyer, and I'm not stealing your recipes. These are mine. They've always been mine." The shock on Thomas Brennan's face would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He clearly hadn't expected Maya to be prepared, to have consulted a lawyer, to have documented everything. "You can't prove anything," he sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the stainless steel counter between them with a satisfying thud. "Actually, I can. I've dated photographs of every creation I've made in your kitchen for the past 8 months. I have my original recipe notebooks with timestamps. I have testimonies from Jake and several customers stating that I personally made their orders. I have recordings of you taking credit for my work. Would you like me to continue?" The color drained from Thomas's face as reality crashed over him like a cold wave, and Maya felt a surge of power she'd never experienced before. The power of preparation meeting opportunity, the power of truth armed with evidence. The scene was unfolding in the kitchen, but the front-of-house staff had heard the commotion and gathered near the doorway, witnessing the confrontation that had been building for months. Sarah, the front counter manager, stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. 2 prep cooks had stopped their work, watching with wide eyes, and Jake stood slightly behind Maya, his phone out and recording, making no attempt to hide it this time. Thomas noticed the audience and tried to regain control, tried to resurrect the authoritative persona he'd wielded like a weapon for so long. This is ridiculous. Everyone knows I built this bakery's reputation. I trained you. Everything you know, you learned from me. His voice was loud, performative, directed at the watching employees. But Maya didn't flinch. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, and now that it was here, she felt eerily calm. Thomas, you've never trained me in anything. You've never shown me a single technique. Every skill I have came from culinary school and my own practice. The only thing I learned from you was how not to treat people. Maya spoke her truth with the clarity of someone who'd spent months finding her voice, each word deliberate and backed by irrefutable evidence. For 8 months, I've worked 70-hour weeks in your kitchen. I've created every signature item that's made this bakery famous in the past year. The lavender honey cake that won Portland Magazine's Best Dessert Award, mine. The pistachio cream puffs that went viral and brought in thousands of dollars in orders, mine. The chocolate raspberry torte that food critics drive from Seattle to taste, mine. Every innovation, every technique, every flavor profile that's elevated Brennan's from a decent bakery to a destination came from my hands, my training, my creativity. And you've taken credit for all of it while paying me barely above minimum wage and verbally abusing me daily. Her voice grew stronger with each sentence, fed by months of suppressed anger and newfound courage. You've called me fat, lazy, incompetent, and worthless. You've told customers you made pastries that I stayed up all night perfecting. You've given interviews about your process when you can barely make a basic buttercream. And you've gotten away with it because I was too afraid to speak up. But I'm not afraid anymore. The evidence Maya presented was devastating in its thoroughness, the result of months of careful documentation that Thomas had been too arrogant to notice. She opened the folder and pulled out printed photographs, each one dated and stamped, showing her creating various pastries from start to finish. Here's me making the wedding cake for the Morrison event, the one you demonstrated on Good Morning Portland, claiming it was your technique. She laid out another series of photos. Here's my original recipe notebook for the brown butter croissants, dated 3 months before they appeared on your menu. She pulled out her phone and played a recording. Thomas's voice clear as he told a reporter, "I've been perfecting this lavender cake recipe for years." Then she played another clip. This one from a customer consultation where Maya explained the exact same recipe in detail, dated 2 weeks before Thomas's interview. "I have 47 recordings like this," Maya said quietly. 47 instances of you stealing my work. The kitchen had gone completely silent, except for the hum of the refrigerators. Sarah's hand was covering her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The lies Thomas Brennan had built his recent success on began crumbling like over-baked meringue, brittle and impossible to salvage once the cracks appeared. He tried to mount a defense, his voice desperate now, the bluster gone, and replaced with something that sounded almost like pleading. "Maya, you're misunderstanding. This is how kitchens work. The head chef takes credit for the team's work. That's standard in the industry. You're being naive." But Maya shook her head, her dark eyes blazing with righteous anger. "No, Thomas. In a real kitchen, the head chef leads, teaches, and gives credit where it's due. They don't steal, they don't abuse, and they don't lie. You're not a chef. You're a fraud." She turned to address the assembled staff, her voice carrying clearly. "How many of you have watched him take credit for work you've done? How many of you have been insulted, belittled, or harassed? Sarah, didn't he tell that newspaper reporter that his attention to detail in customer service was why the front of house ran so smoothly, when you're the one who created the entire system?" Sarah nodded slowly, anger flickering across her face. Yeah, he did." Maya's moment of standing her ground became the turning point. The instant when power definitively shifted in the room, like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm breaks. Thomas lunged forward, trying to grab the folder of evidence, but Jake stepped between them, his young face set with determination. "Don't touch her," Jake said firmly. Thomas rounded on him instead. "You're fired. Both of you are fired. Get out of my bakery right now." Maya laughed, and it was a sound of pure liberation. "We already quit, Thomas. This is just me making sure everyone knows the truth before I go." She turned back to the staff, her voice gentler now. "I'm starting my own business, Maya Rodriguez Pastry Artist. I'll be taking custom orders from my home kitchen initially, then opening a physical location once I secure funding. If any of you want to work in an environment where you're respected and credited for your contributions, I'm hiring." The offer hung in the air like a challenge, and Maya watched as something shifted in Sarah's expression, a decision being made in real time. The public support began immediately, starting with Sarah stepping forward and saying clearly, "I'd like to apply." Then one of the prep cooks raised his hand tentatively. "Me too." The young woman who did cake decorating on weekends pulled out her phone and opened Maya's Instagram right there, hitting follow and like on every post. "I've been wanting to leave for months," she said. "He takes credit for my decorating work too." Within minutes, 3 of Thomas's 5 employees had effectively quit, and the remaining 2 looked uncertain, their loyalty visibly wavering. But the real tsunami of support came from the digital world. Maya's Instagram was exploding with notifications, her follower count jumping from 800 to over 5,000 in the hour since her post. Food bloggers were sharing her story. Former Brennan's customers were commenting that they'd always suspected something was off. A prominent Portland food critic named Diana Chen posted, "I'm devastated to learn that Brennan's bakery has been built on stolen labor and lies. I'll be revisiting my reviews and following Maya Rodriguez's work closely. The talent I praised belongs to her." The validation was overwhelming. Years of being dismissed and diminished, suddenly reversed by an outpouring of support. Thomas Brennan's downfall accelerated with the velocity of an avalanche, each revelation triggering the next until there was no stopping the destruction of his reputation. Jessica, the food blogger who'd first questioned his TV demonstration, published a long-form article within hours titled "The Truth Behind Brennan's Bakery Success: How One Woman's Genius Was Stolen." She'd interviewed Maya, reviewed all the evidence, and spoke to former employees going back years who confirmed a pattern of credit theft and abuse. The article went viral in Portland's food community, then spread to regional and eventually national food publications. Marcus, the journalist who'd been investigating, released his piece the same day, corroborating everything with even more damning evidence. He'd found that Thomas had been ordering pre-made components and passing them off as handmade, violating food safety protocols and defrauding customers. The local news picked up the story. By evening, camera crews were outside Brennan's bakery, and Thomas was forced to give a statement. He tried to deny everything, but his stammering, defensive posture told a different story. Customers began demanding refunds, wedding bookings cancelled. The Brennan family name, cultivated over 3 generations, was being destroyed in a single day. The karmic justice of watching Thomas's empire crumble felt surreal to Maya, like witnessing a building demolition in slow motion, each support beam collapsing until the whole structure came down. She spent that first day at home, her tiny apartment transformed into command central, her laptop open to manage the flood of messages and orders coming through. Jake sat beside her, helping field inquiries, his organizational skills keeping them from drowning in the sudden attention. "Maya, you have 37 orders for next weekend," he said, his voice awed. "And that's just the ones I've been able to sort through. Your inbox has over 300 messages." Maya felt dizzy with the sudden shift, from being invisible to being seen by thousands, from having her work stolen to having customers specifically seeking her out. "Mrs. Chen called personally. I always knew something wasn't right," she said warmly. "The way Thomas acted versus the artistry of the work never matched. I'm so glad you're free of him. I'm telling everyone I know to order from you." By the end of the week, Maya had more orders than she could possibly fulfill alone, even with Jake's help. The weakness that Thomas had tried to weaponize against Maya, her body, her softness, her supposed lack of worth, became irrelevant in the face of her undeniable talent and the community's overwhelming support. The narrative shifted completely. She wasn't the fat baker Thomas gave a chance to. She was Maya Rodriguez, virtuoso pastry chef, whose work was so exceptional it had carried a mediocre bakery to fame. Her Instagram bio read simply, "Pastry artist. Every body is a baker's body." Portland, Oregon. She posted photos of herself in the kitchen, her soft arms dusted with flour, her round face focused in concentration, her full figure moving with grace and confidence as she worked. The comments were overwhelmingly positive. "You're gorgeous and talented. Thank you for showing that bakers come in all sizes. Your joy in creating is so inspiring." For every troll who tried to comment on her body, 100 supporters shut them down. Maya realized something profound. When you're undeniably excellent at what you do, when you own your truth and your talent, the people who try to diminish you lose their power. They become background noise, easily dismissed. The complete reversal of fortune happened faster than Maya had dared to dream. A vindication so thorough it almost felt fictional. Within 2 weeks of leaving Brennan's, she'd secured a small business loan specifically for women entrepreneurs, helped by the publicity and the clear demand for her work. She found a commercial kitchen space to rent in an up-and-coming neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but clean, legal, and hers. Jake became her first official employee, and Sarah joined a week later as her operations manager. The three of them worked around the clock, fulfilling orders, building systems, creating a business from scratch. Maya's creations were even more spectacular now that she was free from Thomas's constraints and criticisms. She experimented wildly, combining her Mexican heritage with classical French techniques, creating fusion desserts that were entirely her own. Horchata crème brûlée, très léger croissant, champorado chocolate tart. Food critics went wild. "Rodriguez isn't just talented," one review read. "She's revolutionary." Her waiting list for custom cakes extended 3 months out. She was working harder than ever, but the exhaustion felt different. This was building something, not being torn down. This was creation in freedom. Meanwhile, Thomas Brennan's bakery hemorrhaged customers and credibility like a severed artery, the decline rapid and irreversible. The health department investigated based on Marcus's reporting and found numerous violations related to the pre-made components and mislabeled ingredients. Thomas was fined heavily. His remaining employees quit within a month, unable to handle the toxic environment and the public shame of working there. Wedding clients sued for breach of contract when Thomas couldn't deliver the quality he'd promised, quality that had always come from Maya's hands. The bakery that had been Portland's premier destination became a cautionary tale. The beautiful storefront that had once had lines around the block sat empty most days. Food bloggers posted before and after content, comparing the artistry of Maya's era to the mediocre pastries Thomas produced on his own. 6 months after Maya left, Brennan's bakery closed its doors permanently, unable to survive without the stolen genius that had been its foundation. The building went up for lease, a hollow shell, a monument to what happens when you build success on lies. The aftermath of her escape from Brennan's left Maya in a strange emotional space, processing trauma while simultaneously experiencing unprecedented success, grief and triumph tangled together like braided dough. She found herself waking up at 3 a.m. sometimes, heart pounding, having dreamed that she was back in Thomas's kitchen, small and silent and erased. Other mornings, she'd wake up laughing, remembering the look on his face when she'd presented her folder of evidence, the moment his world started crumbling. Jake noticed her occasional distant looks during their long workdays and would gently redirect her. "Hey, you're not there anymore. You're here, in your own kitchen, creating on your own terms." The reminder helped, but Maya knew she needed to really process what had happened, to unpack years of internalized shame and abuse. She started seeing a therapist, a warm woman named Dr. Patricia, who specialized in workplace trauma and body image. "What Thomas did to you was systematic abuse," Dr. Patricia told her in their first session. Healing isn't going to happen overnight, but you've already taken the hardest step. You left. You spoke your truth. Now we work on rebuilding your sense of self. New opportunities materialized with stunning regularity, as if the universe was compensating for the years Maya had spent in the shadows, invisible and uncredited. A local morning show invited her to do a live baking demonstration, the same show Thomas had appeared on months earlier. Maya accepted, and the segment became one of their highest-rated episodes, viewers captivated by her warmth, her skill, and her story. She talked openly about the abuse she'd endured and how she'd found the courage to leave. If you're in a situation where your work is being stolen, where you're being diminished, document everything, she told the camera. Know your worth, and when you're ready, take your talent somewhere it will be appreciated. The show's producer asked her to come back monthly. Then a publishing company reached out, interested in a cookbook combining her Mexican heritage with French pastry techniques. The advance they offered was more money than Maya had made in 2 years at Brennan's. She signed the deal with shaking hands, Jake and Sarah cheering beside her. Maya invested in herself with the kind of intentionality she'd never been able to afford before, both financially and emotionally, building the foundation she'd always deserved. She enrolled in an advanced business management course for entrepreneurs, learning about marketing, scaling, financial planning. She hired a professional photographer to document her creations properly. She bought equipment she'd always dreamed of, a high-end stand mixer, professional-grade piping tips, a blast chiller that let her work with chocolate and sugar in ways she'd never been able to before. She redesigned her entire work wardrobe, buying chef's whites that actually fit her curves properly, custom-made in colors beyond standard white, deep burgundy, forest green, midnight blue. She looked powerful in them, professional and proud. She got a new haircut, her thick dark hair styled in layers that framed her face beautifully. Not because she needed to change, but because she wanted to celebrate herself, to invest in the woman she was becoming. The woman who'd always been there, but had been hidden under layers of shame and fear. The transformation wasn't physical in the way toxic diet culture might celebrate, but it was visible nonetheless, radiating from the inside out like light through stained glass. Maya's entire presence changed. She walked differently, her shoulders back, her head high, taking up space without apology. She spoke with authority, her voice clear and confident, whether she was consulting with clients or managing her small but growing team. She laughed more, deep belly laughs that filled her commercial kitchen with joy. She wore clothes that fit and flattered her curves instead of hiding them, jewel-toned dresses and well-fitted jeans, her style finally reflecting her personality. She started doing her makeup before work sometimes, not to hide but to enhance, bold lipstick that made her smile even brighter. The change was spiritual, psychological, a woman stepping fully into her power and her body after years of being told she was too much and not enough simultaneously. Customers often commented on her glow, and Maya would smile, knowing it wasn't about losing weight or changing her fundamental self. It was about losing shame and changing her circumstances. Maya's voice in her industry grew exponentially as she began using her platform, not just to showcase her work, but to advocate for others who'd been marginalized and abused. She started a series on her Instagram called Kitchen Stories, where she interviewed other bakers, chefs, and food industry workers about their experiences with workplace abuse, credit theft, and discrimination. The responses were overwhelming. Dozens of people reached out to share their stories, many of them echoing her own experience of being talented but invisible, of having their work stolen by more privileged colleagues. Maya compiled resources, information about workers' rights, about how to document abuse, about small business loans and grants for underrepresented entrepreneurs. She became a mentor to young pastry chefs, particularly women of color and plus-size women who face the same prejudices she had. Your body doesn't determine your worth or your skill. she told them in workshops and speaking engagements. Don't let anyone make you small. Be loud, be excellent, take up space. Thomas Brennan's current state was something Maya learned about peripherally, through the industry grapevine and occasional mentions in local news. And while she felt no pleasure in his downfall, she felt no guilt either, only the neutral observation of consequences finally arriving. The bakery building had been sold at auction, bought by a young couple who were turning it into a community arts space. Thomas had tried to get investors for a new venture, but his reputation was permanently tarnished. No one willing to risk capital on a proven liar and abuser. He'd declared bankruptcy, unable to pay the fines and legal settlements from the health department violations and the breach of contract lawsuits. Maya heard through Sarah that he'd moved to a different state. Arizona maybe, trying to start over somewhere his name wasn't synonymous with fraud. She felt a complex swirl of emotions when she heard that. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of cosmic balance. He'd tried to steal her future and instead had lost his own. The empire he'd inherited from his father, built over 3 generations, destroyed in months by his own cruelty and dishonesty. A subplot of connection and deepening friendship with Jake had been developing quietly beneath the chaos of building her business, a relationship that surprised Maya with its depth and steadiness. Jake had proven himself invaluable, not just as a skilled baker, but as a true partner in her vision, someone who understood her creative process and supported her ambitions without ego or competition. They worked in easy synchronicity, anticipating each other's needs in the kitchen, communicating in shorthand, developed over long hours of collaborative creation. But it was more than professional respect. Jake made her laugh during stressful moments, brought her coffee exactly how she liked it without being asked, stayed late to help clean up without complaint. He talked to her about his life, his fears, his dreams of maybe opening a small cafe someday that served pastries and supported local artists. He listened when she processed her trauma, offering quiet support without trying to fix or minimize. Their lunch breaks, sitting on the back steps of the commercial kitchen, became Maya's favorite part of the day. 30 minutes of easy conversation and companionable silence, watching the Portland rain or sunshine, depending on the day. Maya faced a new challenge that tested everything she'd learned about standing in her power when a large hotel chain approached her about a contract to supply their restaurants with pastries. The money was substantial, enough to allow her to hire more staff and possibly open a retail location sooner than planned. But the contract included a clause that the hotel would market the items as artisan pastries by our culinary team, with no mention of Maya or her business name. It was Thomas Brennan all over again. Different packaging, but the same theft of credit. The hotel representative, a stern man in an expensive suit, had looked at her like she was being difficult when she'd questioned the clause. "This is standard," he'd said dismissively. "You'd be a vendor, not a partner. Vendors don't get credit." Maya had felt the old fear rising, the voice that said she should just be grateful for the opportunity, that she was being unreasonable. But then she'd looked at Jake and Sarah, both of whom were sitting in on the meeting, and seen their faces. Jake was shaking his head slightly. Sarah looked disgusted, and Maya realized she had a choice. She could repeat the past, or she could honor how far she'd come. The moment of doubt almost won. The old patterns of people-pleasing and self-diminishment rising up like muscle memory, trying to override her hard-won confidence. Maya opened her mouth to accept the contract, to rationalize that this was different, that it was just business, that she could build her brand other ways, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she heard her grandmother's voice. That day in the kitchen when young Maya had been bullied, Abuela saying, "Never let small people make you feel small." And she heard Dr. Patricia from their last therapy session. "You get to decide what you're worth, Maya. Not them. You." Maya closed the portfolio of contract documents and slid it back across the table to the hotel representative. "No," she said clearly. "This isn't standard for me. My name and my business are part of what makes my pastries valuable. If you want my work, you give me credit. Those are my terms." The man looked shocked, then annoyed. "You're making a mistake. Do you know how many bakers would kill for this opportunity?" Maya stood up, gathering her things. "Then offer it to them. I don't work in the shadows anymore. I don't make other people look good at my own expense, not ever again." Maya remembered her journey with such clarity it sometimes felt like looking at someone else's life. The woman she'd been 8 months ago, barely recognizable compared to the woman she was now. She thought about that first day at Brennan's, so hopeful and naive, willing to endure anything for a chance. She thought about the months of swallowing insults, of watching her creations be credited to a man who could barely make buttercream. She thought about crying in the walk-in freezer, feeling worthless and trapped. And then she thought about the moment she'd walked into Thomas's office with her folder of evidence, the moment she'd posted that Instagram photo, the moment she'd said no to the hotel contract. Each act of courage, building on the last, each time she used her voice, making it stronger. The journey hadn't been linear. She still had bad days when the old shame crept in, when she caught herself apologizing for taking up space or doubting her worth. But those moments were becoming rarer, overpowered by a deeper knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. A significant milestone arrived 6 months after Maya left Brennan's, when she signed the lease on her first retail location, a charming corner space in Portland's trendy Alberta Arts District with big windows and exposed brick walls. The space was small but perfect, room for a display case, a few tables and an open kitchen so customers could watch her work. She designed every detail with intention, from the warm lighting to the vintage photographs of her grandmother's kitchen in Mexico City to the color scheme of sage green and warm terracotta. The sign above the door read, "Maya Rodriguez, Pastry Artist," in elegant script, her name finally in lights, literally. The day she got the keys, Maya stood alone in the empty space and cried, overwhelmed with gratitude and disbelief. Jake and Sarah found her there, tears streaming down her face, and wrapped her in a hug. "You did it," Sarah whispered. "You actually did it." The grand opening was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and the advance buzz was incredible, people already lining up to reserve spots for opening day. Maya became the person she'd needed when she was suffering, using her success and platform to create the support system she'd wished for during her darkest days at Brennan's. She established a small grant fund for culinary students from underrepresented backgrounds, giving 3 scholarships a year to help cover tuition and supplies. She partnered with a local women's shelter, teaching free baking classes and providing employment opportunities to survivors of domestic violence. She spoke at high schools and community colleges about her journey, always emphasizing that success wasn't about changing yourself to fit someone else's vision, but about finding places and people who celebrated who you already were. She hired deliberately, building a team that reflected Portland's diversity, creating a workplace where everyone was respected, credited, and paid fairly. Her kitchen became known in the industry as one of the best places to work, and she had a waiting list of people wanting to join her team. When a young plus-size culinary student named Andrea reached out asking for advice, Maya invited her to shadow for a week, teaching her everything, sharing all the knowledge that Thomas had hoarded. "There's enough success to go around," Maya told Andrea. "Lifting others up doesn't diminish your light. It creates more light." The moment of true victory came not with fanfare or public celebration, but in a quiet moment of recognition that rippled through Maya's chest like the perfect rise of bread dough, expanding and warm and undeniable. It was opening day of her retail location, and the line of customers stretched around the block, people she knew and strangers alike, waiting to taste her creations and support her business. Local news cameras were there documenting the event. Food bloggers were posting real-time updates. But what made Maya's eyes fill with tears was seeing her former culinary school instructors in line, the French pastry chef who'd told her she had gifted hands, the business management teacher who'd encouraged her to dream big, They'd come to honor her, to witness her triumph, and standing near the front of the line, looking older and smaller somehow, was Mrs. Chen, the customer who'd first asked for Maya by name, the woman who'd helped crack open the truth. "I wouldn't miss this for anything," Mrs. Chen said warmly, pulling Maya into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." Maya looked at the crowd, at Jake and Sarah managing the organized chaos with efficiency and joy, at the shop bearing her name, and thought, this is what freedom tastes like. Thomas Brennan's final appearance in Maya's story was almost anticlimactic, a moment of confrontation that proved how much power he'd lost and how much Maya had gained. He showed up at her shop 3 months after opening, walking in during a quiet Tuesday afternoon, looking haggard and defeated. Maya was behind the counter, ringing up an order when she looked up and saw him, and for just a second, she felt the old fear, the old instinct to make herself small. But it passed quickly, replaced by curiosity and a strange sort of pity. "Thomas," she said evenly, "what can I do for you?" He seemed surprised that she'd acknowledged him, that she hadn't thrown him out or called the police. "I just wanted to see," he said quietly, looking around at the space she'd created, the customers at tables enjoying her pastries, the display case full of her artistry. "I wanted to see if it was real." Maya wiped her hands on her apron and came around the counter. "It's real. This is what happens when talent is allowed to flourish instead of being suppressed and stolen. This is what you could have had if you'd been secure enough to share credit and build people up instead of tearing them down." Maya's decision about Grace was one she'd thought about extensively in therapy, discussing with Dr. Patricia whether she owed Thomas anything, whether forgiveness was necessary for her own healing, or just another way women were expected to make men comfortable. Standing there facing him in her own shop, seeing how diminished he'd become, Maya realized she didn't need to forgive him for his sake, but she could release her anger for her own sake. "I don't forgive what you did," she said clearly. "You stole my work, you abused me, and you tried to destroy my confidence. Those things were wrong, and the consequences you faced were deserved. But I'm not going to carry anger for you anymore. You don't get that space in my life. You're simply irrelevant to me now." She went back behind the counter. "I won't serve you, but I won't throw you out either. You can look around if you want. See what happens when you treat people with respect." Thomas stood there for a moment longer, seeming to struggle with something, then turned and walked out. Maya watched him go and felt nothing. No triumph, no anger, no satisfaction. Just the peaceful neutrality of a closed chapter. Reflection on her journey became a practice Maya incorporated into her daily routine, a way of staying grounded and remembering how far she'd come when challenges inevitably arose. Every evening before leaving the shop, she'd take 5 minutes to sit in the kitchen alone, breathing in the smells of butter and sugar and vanilla, looking at what she'd created that day. She'd think about the young woman who'd started at Brennan's 8 months ago, so full of hope and so willing to accept crumbs. She'd think about the moment in the walk-in freezer when she'd hit bottom, Jake finding her crying in the cold. She'd think about the courage it took to walk away, to trust herself, to believe she was worth more. The lessons were clear now, visible in retrospect like a map of terrain she'd crossed. She'd learned that talent without self-advocacy is vulnerable to exploitation. She'd learned that documentation is power. She'd learned that allies matter, that Jake's support had been crucial to her finding her voice. She'd learned that her body was never the problem, the prejudice was. Most importantly, she'd learned that she could survive losing everything she thought she needed and discover that what she actually needed was already inside her. Maya's new life, fully established and thriving, exceeded even her most optimistic dreams from those dark days at Brennan's. Her shop had become a Portland institution in less than a year, featured in national food magazines and on culinary tourism guides. She'd hired 5 full-time employees and was training 2 apprentices. The cookbook was nearly finished, scheduled for publication the following spring, with a major house backing it. She'd been invited to judge a national baking competition on television. She was dating, nothing serious yet, but exploring connection without the urgency or desperation of someone who didn't know their own worth. She had a retirement account for the first time in her life. She'd paid off half her student loans. She was looking at buying a small house instead of renting. These practical successes mattered, but what mattered more was how she felt in her body, in her life. She woke up excited for work instead of dreading it. She created without fear of having her ideas stolen. She laughed easily and often. She took up space without apology. She was, for perhaps the first time in her life, genuinely happy. The inspiration Maya provided to others became its own reward, a legacy building in real time as her story spread and encouraged people facing similar struggles. She received dozens of messages weekly from people who'd seen her interviews or read articles about her, sharing their own experiences with workplace abuse, body discrimination, credit theft. Many of them were stuck in situations similar to where she'd been, afraid to leave, afraid they weren't good enough, afraid no one would believe them. Maya responded to as many as she could, offering practical advice and emotional support. Document everything, she'd write. Know the law, build your safety net quietly, and when you're ready, trust your wings. Several people had taken her advice and left toxic situations to start their own ventures, and they'd reach back out to thank her, to tell her that her courage had given them courage. A body-positive activist invited Maya to speak at a conference about how diet culture and fat phobia intersected with workplace discrimination. The talk went viral online, sparking important conversations. Maya was becoming more than a successful baker. She was becoming a voice for the voiceless, a beacon for anyone who'd ever been told they were too much or not enough. Maya's body, celebrated and reclaimed, became a statement in itself, a radical act of existing joyfully in a world that told women like her to shrink and hide and apologize. She did a photo shoot for a local magazine, wearing a beautiful chef's coat tailored to fit her curves, her hair loose and wild, her smile wide and genuine, her hands covered in flour mid-creation. The image became iconic in Portland, appearing on murals and inspiration boards, a representation of what success and beauty could look like beyond narrow traditional definitions. Maya posted photos of herself on social media regularly now, not hiding her soft stomach or full arms, not angling for the most flattering shot, just existing fully and confidently. She wore a bikini to the beach for the first time in a decade, Jake and Sarah with her, and posted a photo with the caption, "Baker's body at the beach. All bodies are beach bodies." The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. She spoke openly in interviews about body acceptance, about how years of fat phobia had almost prevented her from pursuing her dreams. "Your body is not your limitation," she'd say. "Other people's prejudice is the limitation. Don't let their small minds make you small." The circle complete moment arrived unexpectedly on a rainy November afternoon, exactly 1 year after Maya had walked out of Brennan's with her folder of evidence and her heart pounding. She received a call from a real estate agent asking if she'd be interested in purchasing a property, a corner building in a prime downtown location. "The owner is motivated to sell quickly," the agent said. "It's been empty for 6 months." Maya asked for the address and felt her breath catch when she heard it. It was the Brennan's Bakery building, the place where she'd been diminished and hurt, but also where she'd found her strength and her voice. The building where her talent had been stolen, but also where she'd met Jake and learned to fight back. "I'd like to see it," Maya said quietly. When she walked through the empty space, Jake by her side as always, she felt ghosts of her former self echoing through the industrial kitchen, but they didn't haunt her. They reminded her. This building had been her crucible, the place where she was forged into who she was now. "What do you think?" Jake asked, watching her face. Maya looked around, imagining what the space could become. Not a single shop, but her flagship, a training center, a commissary kitchen for her expanding operation, a place where she could mentor others, where no one would ever be silenced or stolen from. "I think," Maya said slowly, a smile spreading across her face, I think I'm buying it. Maya's transformation of the former Brennan's building into her flagship location was both practical and symbolic, an act of reclamation that felt like justice and healing intertwined. She gutted the space completely, keeping only the bones, removing every trace of Thomas's regime. She redesigned it as an open, light-filled space with a teaching kitchen visible to the street, a cafe area with comfortable seating, and a state-of-the-art production facility in back. She hired a muralist to paint the story of sugar and flour across one wall, images of women from different cultures throughout history making bread, making pastry, feeding communities. She included an image of her grandmother working from an old photograph, Abuela's hands shaping dough with love. The space became a destination, people coming not just for the pastries, but for the atmosphere of joy and respect and celebration. Maya instituted a policy that every employee's name was printed on business cards and mentioned in press materials, everyone credited for their contributions. She paid living wages and provided health care. She created a workplace that she would have thrived in, and because of that, everyone thrived. The grand opening of the flagship location made local news. The story too good not to cover. Woman returns to building where she was abused, now as owner and success story. The final meeting with Jake happened on the rooftop of the new flagship building, where Maya had created a small garden space with herbs she used in her baking and a few tables for employees to take breaks. It was a warm spring evening, the Portland skyline glowing in the sunset, and Maya had asked Jake to meet her after closing. She'd been feeling something building between them for months, a shift from friendship and partnership into something deeper, but she'd been afraid to acknowledge it, afraid to risk their perfect working relationship, afraid that maybe she was misreading the looks he gave her, the way he found excuses to stand close to her in the kitchen, the tenderness with which he treated her. But Dr. Patricia had encouraged her to be brave in her personal life, the way she'd learned to be brave in her professional life. You deserve love, Maya, her therapist had said, and you deserve to ask for what you want. So here she was, heart pounding, watching Jake climb the stairs to the roof, his face breaking into a smile when he saw her. Jake's declaration came before Maya could speak, words tumbling out of him with the earnest intensity she'd come to love, his hands gesturing as he talked, his eyes never leaving her face. Maya, I need to tell you something, and I know the timing might be terrible, and I don't want to make things weird, but I also can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel. He took a deep breath. I've been in love with you since that day in the walk-in freezer when you were crying, and I realized I'd do anything to protect you, to see you happy. I'm in love with your talent, your strength, your kindness, the way you laugh, the way you create beauty from flour and sugar like it's magic. I'm in love with your curves and your smile and the way you hum when you're focused on piping decorations. I'm in love with who you are, exactly as you are, and I have been for so long. He paused, looking vulnerable and hopeful. I know I'm younger than you. I know I work for you, and that complicates things. I know you might not feel the same way, but I couldn't not tell you anymore. You've taught me to be brave, to speak my truth. So here's my truth. I love you, Maya Rodriguez, and I'd be honored to be more than your friend and employee if you want that too. Maya's response came through tears of joy, all the emotions of the past year overwhelming her in the best possible way, standing on this rooftop that symbolized everything she'd overcome and achieved. Jake, she said, her voice shaking, I've been trying to convince myself I was imagining it, that you couldn't possibly see me that way, that I was your boss and you were just being kind. She laughed through her tears. But the truth is, I've been falling in love with you too, with your loyalty and your courage, and the way you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, with your terrible jokes and your organizational skills, and the way you look at me like I'm the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. She stepped closer to him. I never thought I deserved this, deserved you, deserved love that wasn't conditional on changing myself or shrinking myself. But you make me believe I deserve everything good. So yes, Jake Mitchell, yes, I want more. I want everything. The conclusion of their love story was both an ending and a beginning, a culmination of their individual journeys, and the start of a shared path neither had anticipated when they'd first met in Thomas Brennan's toxic kitchen. They started dating officially, navigating the complexity of being both business partners and romantic partners with the same honesty and respect that had characterized their friendship. Maya promoted Sarah to general manager to avoid any appearance of favoritism, and Jake transitioned to head of operations, roles that suited both of them perfectly. Their relationship deepened naturally, built on a foundation of genuine friendship and shared values and mutual respect. They moved in together after 6 months, finding a small house in northeast Portland with a big kitchen where they'd experiment with recipes on weekends, dancing to salsa music and tasting each other's creations and planning their future. A year later, Jake proposed during the shop's anniversary party in front of all their employees and friends and customers, getting down on one knee and saying, "Maya, you taught me what courage looks like. Will you let me spend my life being brave with you?" She said yes, before he'd even finished the question. Thomas Brennan's bankruptcy and failure became a footnote in Maya's story, mentioned briefly in articles about her success, but no longer the defining event of her narrative. The bakery building he'd lost was now thriving under her leadership, a symbol of what happened when talent was nurtured instead of exploited. Thomas himself had disappeared from Portland's food scene entirely, occasionally spotted working as a line cook in unremarkable restaurants in other cities, his name no longer carrying any weight or prestige. Maya heard updates occasionally through the industry grapevine and felt only a distant acknowledgement of how completely their positions had reversed. She'd won not by destroying him, though he'd destroyed himself, but by building something so undeniably excellent mediocrity and cruelty became impossible to ignore. The younger generation of Portland chefs didn't even know who Thomas Brennan was, but they all knew Maya Rodriguez, the pastry chef who'd overcome abuse and discrimination to build an empire of sweetness and justice. That was the legacy that mattered, not his fall, but her rise. Maya Rodriguez's transformation from an abused, invisible employee to a celebrated pastry artist and business owner wasn't about revenge, though karma had certainly played its part. It was about a woman finding her voice, her worth, and her power in a world that tried to take all three. It was about refusing to be small, refusing to let cruelty define her, refusing to accept anything less than the respect and credit she deserved. From a toxic kitchen where she was called fat and lazy to a flagship location bearing her name, from stolen recipes to a published cookbook, from shame to pride, Maya had proven that your body isn't your limitation, your voice does matter, and your story doesn't end when someone tries to write you out of it. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt invisible or undervalued or diminished, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your voice matters. Your story matters. You are not alone in fighting for recognition and respect. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of women who refuse to be small, who transform humiliation into power, who prove that the sweetest revenge is a life well lived and a dream fully realized. Maya's story reminds us that excellence combined with courage is unstoppable, that allies matter, and that sometimes the person who tries to break you actually breaks themselves. Until next time, remember, you are worthy exactly as you are. Your talent belongs to you, and no one can take your light unless you let them. See you in the next one.